to the situation, right? So let's kind of run through these real fast, right? So the Industrial Revolution specifically is going to refer to a transformation, right, from what's called a cottage industry type situation, mostly handmade goods, to machine-made goods. Can you guys see this well enough on my screen? You guys, it looks like you should be able to read it well enough. So I'm not going to expand it, so that way you can kind of, that way it's a little easier for me, okay? But you're going to get, right, this cottage industry prior to the revolution, right? And the Industrial Revolution is going to begin in England, okay? And one of the big reasons why it's able to begin in England is really a lot because of a couple of different reasons, right? You have political stability. For starters, you know, that we've talked about all that before. You have the natural resources is also a really important thing, right? The streams that they have is going to be power sources for mills. You have coal, which is going to really be the first fuel for steam engines and things like that. You're going to also have that raw iron ore, which is going to be really important and used for making machines ultimately, right? Iron and then steel eventually too. The invention of the improvement of the steam engine is really an important piece to this puzzle. And sorry, my cat is kind of crawling all over me a little bit. So anyway, those things are going to be some of the major factors that, you know, the Industrial Revolution begins in England, right? I would definitely know the natural resources aspect in part of this question for sure. So keeping along, right, these technological inventions are going to be extremely important for the Industrial Revolution, and I would for sure know the difference between these people as well. I can tell you there are a couple questions related to inventors and things like that and what they invented. So James Watt, right? James Watt is going to build upon and improve the steam engine, and the steam engine is super important for the production, right? You're going to have a man named Henry Bessemer, and Henry Bessemer is going to develop a process called the Bessemer process, which is basically to quickly and more efficiently make steel. Steel before the Bessemer process was created was significantly difficult to create, and making it from iron ore, and this Bessemer process makes it significantly more efficient and effective and just much more cost-effective. You're also going to have this man named James Hargreaves, and he's going to invent the spinning jenny, which is going to be part of the production for garments and textiles and things like that. Textile mills and textile factories are going to be, you know, benefit from the spinning jenny. Okay, so the industrialization in particular in Britain is going to begin with the cotton textile industry, right? And then from there it's going to expand farther into the iron industry, and then the steel industry is going to be the expansion, right? So you are also going to have this thing known as the Enclosure Movement in England, which is really going to help the industrialization. And really, just to kind of sum it up, you got the 2 points right here. People previously had traditionally allowed their livestock to farm and, you know, graze on common land. But what's going to happen is these wealthy landowners are going to enclose this land for more efficient grazing and farming for themselves, but it's going to keep other people out, right? And that's going to do is it's going to force people away from the agriculture, and it's going to force them into cities, right, where they can find jobs and they can find things where at this point the agriculture had failed for them, right? So that enclosure movement is going to be pretty important to kind of help drive the industrialization, because it's going to push people away from the farms. Okay, so it looks like there's no other questions, so let me keep rolling here. So anyway, moving along the line here, right? So, sorry, just catch up. So you're going to, the enclosure movement, right, also besides the fact that you're now going to have these wealthy landowners, you know, they're enclosing people out from their land, but also it's going to create a much more efficient, effective way for them to create the food, right? So you're going to get a production of more food, right? And that more food is going to lead to population growth, and it's going to continue to force people off of their farms, and that labor force is then going to be ultimately end up in the factories. Does that hopefully make sense to you guys? So that factory system is going to then feed on all of the people that are going into these areas, that are leaving the agricultural areas of England and obviously other places in Europe, and then eventually America too. Factories in particular are large buildings that are holding the machines that are going to be used for the industrial processes to make goods, right? And the factory system is going to crush the cottage industry, right? It's going to be significantly faster to create the goods using the technological advances than doing it from hand, right? And the Industrial Revolution is going to quickly spread from Western Europe, from England to Western Europe and then to the United States, okay? So some major improvements that are going to come about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. You're going to have improvements in transportation, right? You're going to have roads. You're going to have railroads eventually, right? And canals. Hopefully you guys all know what a canal is, but it's basically ways to be able to think of the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, right? Those canals are basically man-made creations of navigable water next to rivers, next to streams, next to wherever, right? It's able to use these canals to move goods and transport places. We have the C&O Canal up on the Potomac River that goes all the way into Washington, D.C., and you can follow the C&O Canal hundreds of miles all the way up, I believe, into Pennsylvania. It's important. It definitely helps drive the Industrial Revolution. You're going to have urbanization, right? These rural populations, these agricultural-based populations are going to drastically decline, and you're going to have a relatively large increased standard of living, but not for everybody, right? That's important. It's not universal, for sure, okay? So you are going to get the growth of the middle class, and population is going to increase. You're going to get increased education. You're going to get some major dissatisfaction with the working conditions. And then also you're going to get some environmental pollution. Okay? All things that you guys should know for sure. Okay? So that's the basics at the beginning there for sure. Any questions about that first kind of part? That should all be a pretty quick recap. Mrs. Kipperman, I know, did those notes with you guys and probably explained some of those things in a little bit better detail than I did, which is all right. This system is messing me up compared to what I'm used to. Okay, so moving, I guess, to the next part of this. So besides the inventors, what other people do you need to know? I'd say the inventors are kind of the only people well, that's not really true. You're going to have Karl Marx and Lenin and those people, the communist people, Mao, for sure you should definitely be aware of. So let's kind of dive into that next part here, I suppose. So give me a minute. Okay, so we didn't necessarily formally go through these notes, but these are a lot of the discussion and topics that Mrs. Kipperman went over on the board with the charts that we did. Okay, so let's look at those. Right, just kind of reading off the slide here. Pre-industrial economies were agriculturally based units, right? They were based around the family, and what's going to happen with the Industrial Revolution is it's going to displace those family cottage industries, right? Those industries where people were creating their own goods in their homes, and you're going to now get the factory system, which is going to significantly impact the structure because a lot of the people are going to be forced to leave the families in the rural areas and forced into the cities. Not all of them necessarily go. Sometimes they all do. They get stuck in some small tenement apartment buildings and tenement housing and things like that, right? So the nature of the work in the factory is really tough, right? You have these harsh working conditions in the factory. You have extremely long working hours, long work weeks. You don't have the benefits of a lot of the things that we have, right? You don't have weekends. You don't have 40-hour work weeks, right? It's extremely difficult, long hours, and you're going to have extremely unhealthy and unsafe working conditions as well, and often low pay. You're getting paid peanuts here. So Women and children themselves are also going to enter the workplace as cheaper labor than the men, but sometimes they just can't afford not to have these other people work in the families, so they need to work anyway, even if they're not going to get paid that much for their time. I don't know why this, let me see if I can get rid of this. There we go. Okay, so men are going to ultimately compete with women and children for the job, job and wages, because especially if women and children will do the job and can do the same job as the men for less money, then effectively the women and children are going to get hired before the men. But these child labor costs are going to keep the cost of production low and profits high for the people that own the means of production. Owners of mines and factories, they ultimately have considerable control over the lives of the people that work for them, right? If people are stuck working for them, otherwise they don't have jobs, they don't have money to feed their families, people are stuck in that situations, right? So in some cases you're going to get company-owned towns and factory-owned town houses, right? They live in these small houses in cramped street and open sewers. Some really just the late 1800s was not a really great time to live. Yes, you're going to get some improvements in the middle class and living conditions in certain cases, but at the cost of working these awful hours and in these awful conditions, right? So with these cases, right, these company-owned stores, if the company owns these towns or these factories, and if you're living in their places, right, sometimes you get paid only by the company dollars or company money. Really, you get paid in company. You can buy things in these company-owned stores, right? Many mines and factory owners, they require activities on days off, such as church attendance and things like that. We didn't go so far into this in class, but it's just interesting to know. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to fix this again. I don't know why. Okay, so ultimately, the tough conditions and the abuses of the worker during the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to the rise of these labor unions, right? And labor unions is organized labor. It's workers organizing into what are known as unions because when they band together, the worker is able to actually get leverage over the people that own the factories and people that employ people here. Because think of it this way, right? If you are an unskilled worker, right? All you're doing is just some small thing on this assembly line or something like that, right? If you have a job that everybody else can do, there's no leverage. You have no leverage, right? If something happens to you, they're just going to hire somebody else to do the exact same job, right? The more skill your job entails, the harder it is to replace you, right? So the thing about unions is that the workers band together, right? And they're able to get leverage then over the employer, right? And they're able to strike and have movements and things for improvements in conditions. And some of these improvements include increased wages, improved working conditions, right? You're going to eventually get laws to improve the lives of workers, including, child labor laws and, helping women and things like that as well, right? Ultimately, unions wanted worker rights to include this idea of collective bargaining between labor and management, right? That when they work together, they can compromise, essentially, right? And that's what collective bargaining is, essentially. You're using the group to collectively bargain with the leverage that you have over the management, right? So there are going to be reforms, right, that are important to understand, right? You're going to start to get expansion of education and eventually compulsory education, right? Women are eventually going to demand the right to vote, and you're going to have the end of child labor, right? So those are some pretty important things for sure that you should be aware of going into tomorrow. Okay, so as far as the impact of the Industrial Revolution on slavery, right? Mrs. Kipperman today, or maybe not today, but the other day, definitely spoke about the cotton gin. And the cotton gin, especially in America, is actually, it's funny because the purpose of the device, right, to make picking the actual cotton threads off of the seed significantly easier. The purpose of the device was actually to make it slaves in less demand. Was one of the reasons why he created it. But the fact is, all it did was boost production so much that they just wanted more and more slaves to pick the cotton. So ultimately, it actually increased the need for slave labor on the American plantations. You're also going to have Britain and the United States eventually outlawing the slave trade, but partially as a result of some of the improvements that are going to come about from the Industrial Revolution. You're going to get the slave trade and then slavery itself, right? So two other names that you need to know for sure. During the Industrial Revolution, you're going to have some major advancements in science and medicine, right? So the first big one is a man named Edward Jenner, and he is arguably one of the most important people that has ever existed. He developed the smallpox vaccination, and that has helped so many people over the world, across the world, and through the work with the vaccination and the people and the doctors and everything, that they've actually eradicated smallpox as a disease around the world. It's actually a pretty incredible thing if you think about it. They actually killed a disease. It no longer exists, at least outside of lab conditions. But this is all based off of also Louis Pasteur, his work with bacteria, and that's why you do the pasteurization process, right, where you're killing the bacteria in things, especially in milk. You can see pasteurized or not, and things like that, right? Okay, any other questions there? How about we get a break to see my cat right there? Hi, cat. He's confused. There's my cat. And where's my dog? Miles. There's Miles. Anyway, all right. So there is my dog and there's my cat, and let's kind of keep going to the last part of this. So Mrs. Kipperman and I, you guys, since you're going to have exclusive into this, Mrs. Kipperman and I have decided that we are not going to have the quiz on, at least imperialism, sorry. So imperialism will be off of the list, and we're just going to include that into the next unit, quiz or test or whatever for World War I and imperialism. So this quiz is going to be a little bit less material for you guys. So the last piece of this puzzle is the whole idea and notes on capitalism and the Industrial Revolution and things like that. Okay, so let's kind of run through that real quick, right? So we know capital is money, right? And therefore capitalism is the belief of private individuals should carry on production and exchange of goods and services, right? So individuals owning factories and things like that, right? So a man named Adam Smith is one of the biggest proponents of capitalism and markets and free markets in particularly. He writes what's called The Wealth of Nations, right? And you get the free market. What he's hoping for, at least in his book, is this free market, right? Very little government control. That basically is the word laissez-faire. Let it be, essentially, is what hey, don't bite. None of that. Okay? So, anyway, you have laissez-faire, right? So, he also argues about the law of supply and demand, right? We talked about that all in class. So, if you have any questions about those things, just write them in the chat quick, right? So, the impact of capitalism, right? Capitalism and the competition that's going to come from it is going to be one of the big fueling factors of the Industrial Revolution, right? You're going to get wealth that's created and generated. You're going to get an increase in standard of living. You're just going to contribute to the growth of the middle class, right? But with a lot of untethered capitalism, right, you're going to get some major dissatisfaction. Those poor work conditions we talked about, right? You're going to get some big unequal distributions of wealth. Don't do it, cat. He's getting antsy. So anyway, unequal distribution of wealth in society, right? And I lost my train of thought because of the cat. So you're going to get this increased dissatisfaction, right? These poor work conditions and unequal distribution of wealth in society, which is going to lead to issues, right? So people are going to be frustrated with capitalism, especially in an unregulated body and system, right? So you get people that start advocating for what's called socialism, right? And socialism it's the state, but not necessarily the state. It's more the workers owning the means of production as together, right? So it gets a little bit tricky, right? So society is going to be able to operate in some sort of welfare state, right? And all the people are going to, you're going to have this distribution of wealth fairly amongst them. Remember the activity we did in class where everyone started more equally versus the capitalism activity when everyone started with different numbers, and the people that had the most to start with typically did the best, whereas when there was a little bit more of a level playing field, things were a little bit closer, right? And this is sometimes called the welfare state, right? But there are obviously socialistic things in this country, right? We have Social Security is obviously a socialized thing. There's all other things we talked about in class too, that are socialized things and parts of our society that people use, Medicare, Medicaid, and things like that, right? So without those people, that safety net, it could be a little interesting for sure, right? But anyway, there are certain states that have taken socialism to the next level, and that is a big thing, right? So this is just the cartoon, right? The workers coming together and getting the fist. It's a symbol of socialism. You have some European countries today that are, have democratic socialist type governments for sure. They have parliaments and things and legislatures and things like that, but they have socialistic type policies, right? The governments themselves, are going to own many of these industries, right? And you have situations where there is free healthcare, right? Education and childcare, but what this is achieved through higher taxes, right? So people's wealth is taxed significantly higher levels to provide these things, and they're doing that because they feel it is a high benefit to society, and those things are important. So that's why they do that, right? So anyway, this is often, as I said, achieved through those peaceful parliamentary means, right? They are voting for these things. There's no dictator here. There's no, this is voted for by the representatives and the people, right? So we've got this map, if you will, of self-proclaimed socialist countries at some point in history. Whoops, wrong button there. So you have a lot of stemming from Russia and such. A lot of some in Northern Africa, some South America, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, obviously. So the difference is, right? You have socialism and you have communism, and communism is technically a form of socialism. Okay, there is a bit of a difference there, right? So Karl Marx is going to write two books in particular, but the big one is known as the Communist Manifesto, right? He's going to write this with a man named Friedrich Engels, right? And it's going to be response to the injustices of capitalism, right? And what it's calling for is no private ownership of property, and what he wants and what they talk about, right, is that all property should be owned by the community, and they're looking for a classless society. Why is this getting cut off? Can I make this smaller? So classless society where everyone has equal and social economic status, right? And that's the dream, and that's the hope of these communists, but obviously we know that it doesn't quite necessarily always work out that way, and it's obviously, for sure. So Marx, what he is hoping for and what he's calling for is that ultimately the injustices and the class warfare that exist as a result of the classes, the result of capitalism and untethered capitalism, right? That though you're going to get the proletariat, which are the workers, the names that he dubs, are going to basically create this class warfare and this war with the bourgeoisie, right? The owners of the means of production, and the workers and the proletariat are going to seize control of these things, right? And that effectively, ultimately, they will, take control of the means of production, and then eventually transfer that means of production over to the state. So that's the difference between socialism and communism. That socialism is a step towards communism, essentially, at least in the Marxist view. So anyway, right, this redistribution of wealth is extremely important to communists, and you have the thing here you can take a look at, right? So the last piece, and we've only got 5 or so people. There are 28 questions. Yes, Kevin. So the impact of communism, and this is something that you're definitely going to need to know, I can tell you that, right, is that it has the existence of communism and the battle between communism and capitalism, has effectively been one of the most damaging things in recent history, for sure. You're going to have violent revolutions around the world, and it's going to lead to the death of a lot of different people, right? And sadly, in this vision anyway, from a Marxist or Lenin viewpoint, if you will, you're going to get totalitarian regimes created as a result of these communist revolutions, right? And that's not necessarily in the spirit of communism, but it's just kind of the way things go naturally. And there's going to have been mass slaughter and poverty. You're going to have some major international conflicts, right? You have Mao Zedong here leading the People's Republic of China. There's a revolution in the late 1950s. You have Fidel Castro and Che Guevara down here. You've got Mao posing with Ho Chi Minh. You have a scene from the Russian Revolution down here. The communists take over there. So you have these issues and these things that are a result of the pop-up of communism. And it's just an interesting thing, right? Because it obviously starts with good intentions, trying to fix the issues of capitalism the way they see it anyway, right? But anyway, we know how things have gone in the past. So, all right, that all said, that's kind of the end here of this live stream. I'm sorry it took a little while to get going. I'm glad I still got some of you guys here. And from that, I'm going to leave you guys be to your studying. Enjoy the delay tomorrow. Hopefully we get to sleep in, and who knows, maybe we'll get lucky and it'll be more slippery in the morning and we'll get off, right? Wouldn't that be exciting? Okay, so have a great night, guys. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and make sure to study. Yep, crash courses probably wouldn't be a bad thing. And you can rewatch this video too. This video should end up, you should be able to just rewind and watch it as many times as you want, but it'll also archive to YouTube once it's done. Okay, so let me change this name of this though. I can't do that here. Okay, anyway, see you guys.